All right, thank you for inviting me to speak on this today. So again, I'm going to be talking about the NIH perspective on rigor and reproducibility. Let me make sure I got the slides going here. Okay, so I want to start with this graphic. This is taken from Nature magazine, on which they did a survey of 1,576 researchers. They did an online survey asking them whether there was a whether there is a reproducibility crisis. Now, as you can see here, 90% of the respondents agreed, yes, there is a reproducibility crisis, and over half of them said, yes, it is a significant crisis. Okay. Now, it's understandable why people would say, yes, there's this reproducibility crisis in that number, because, this is something that we've been hearing about all the time in the press. It particularly focuses on preclinical research, a lot of these studies. Now, in particular, there were two papers that came out, one from Amgen, one from Bayer, that stated that they were unable to replicate or reproduce the majority of the published data. And those are shown here, right here, this paper and this paper, so Begley and Prince papers. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that we really don't know, this paper was not exactly transparent, so we don't know what studies they tried to reproduce. We don't know how they tried to reproduce, whether they followed everything correctly. So I just want to put that caveat out there, okay? Okay, so what was the NIH response to the reproducibility issue? Okay, so this is a picture of the National Institutes of Health. This is in the front of the clinical center. So the NIH consists of 27 institutes and centers. The NIH invests about $30 billion annually in biomedical research. Now, 80% of those funds are awarded to institutions in the United States and around the world. Now, that's a lot of money, and so keeping in mind that we are stewards of the taxpayers' money, we have to keep in mind also this goal. One of the goals of the NIH is to exemplify and promote the highest level of scientific integrity, public accountability, and social responsibility in the conduct of science. Okay, now I want to go back to the year 2002. So in 2002, there were several studies that were published showing that a drug called minocycline was able to increase survival of SOD1 transgenic mice. And these mice served as a model for ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. Okay? So based on these studies, the NIH decided that they would go ahead and fund a clinical trial with minocycline with hundreds of ALS patients. And this trial went on for years. And in the end, the trial failed. Now, when the NIH went back to try and determine why did this fail, they looked back at those mouse studies, and they found that many of those papers were missing key details, including whether the study was blinded, whether the animals were randomized to groups, and they didn't include sample size estimations. And in many cases, they were underpowered studies, so they didn't use enough mice to detect a difference. They also didn't mention the number of the transgene copy number in these transgenic mice, which can very, very much affect the results. So in 2012, NINDS was the institute that funded this at the NIH. They brought together a lot of stakeholders, including editors, researchers, to discuss this problem. Like, how did we end up here, where we were? So in 2012, this paper here is a result of that workshop, and it was a call for transparent reporting to optimize the predictive value of preclinical research, okay? So basically this paper spells out that it's very important to go back and look at the rigor of the previous studies before continuing on, particularly in translational studies. Now, in 2014, the NIH published several perspectives on this issue of reproducibility to try and call attention to the problems. Okay, so the first one on the left is fixing problems with cell lines. Now, this perspective really spelled out the problems with the use of misidentified cell lines. So, for instance, since the 1960s, there have been 400 misidentified cell lines used, and they continue to be used today. Not all of them, but many of them. So in the next paper I'm showing here was an editorial, or not editorial, a paper by Dr. Collins and Dr. Tabak, the NIH director and deputy director. And in this paper, they really called out all the problems that can lead to reproducibility, these perverse incentives. And they also mentioned that the NIH was going to start implementing actions to try and enhance reproducibility. And some of those actions were going to be changes to application instructions and reviewer guidance. Okay. And then the other paper on the right basically just tells the community that the NIH is concerned about the lack of female reporting or in preclinical data, in preclinical research. Okay? So this was basically telling the community that we're now going to require that you study both sexes in vertebrate animal studies and human studies. Okay. Also in 2014, the NIH gathered about 30 editors to come up with these principles and guidelines for reporting preclinical research. And those are shown here, so that includes rigorous statistical analysis, transparency in reporting, data and material sharing, consideration of refutations, consider establishing best practice guidelines for antibodies, cell lines, and animals. And since these guidelines were published, we've had about 135 journals sign on to these guidelines. Okay, so what did the NIH do? Now, so the policy that I'm going to describe to you is called Enhancing Reproducibility Through Rigor and Transparency. So it's rigor and transparency to get to reproducibility, because rigor and transparency is easier to measure, particularly in the short term, whereas reproducibility is more difficult to measure, and it's something that you would really need to measure in the long term. Okay, so it's a short-term focus to achieve long-term goals. All right, so these are the changes or the updates that the NIH made to the grant applications and review language. So there were 4 areas that were focused on. So, oops, sorry, how do I go back? Okay. So on the left are the 4 areas. So the first area is scientific premise. So now applicants are required to do an assessment of the previous research that they're using to base their proposal on, okay? So they need to indicate the weaknesses and the strengths of those studies, so they need to really discuss the rigor of those studies. And if they identify any weaknesses or gaps, then they're expected to tell us how they're going to address those weaknesses or gaps, okay? And the second element or area is scientific rigor. And this is really asking the applicants to describe more experimental detail, okay, so that the reviewers can really make an assessment as to how rigorous the study is. They also need to include information on their analysis plans, okay? And the third area is consideration of relevant biological variables such as sex. So as you know, biological variables, including age, weight, and sex, can affect the outcome of a study in vertebrate animal studies and human studies as well. So the NIH expects that applicants consider these as they're designing their studies. Now, in particular, the NIH requires that investigators use both sexes. Okay, so we want to start collecting more data on both sexes. Now, in the early stages of research, we don't expect people to start to become, sex difference researchers. We expect them to start including small numbers of animals, both sexes, and then start to collect that data and report that data, so then we can then start to accumulate this information on sex differences, okay? And the fourth area is called authentication of key biological and/or chemical resources. Now, this requirement kind of came about because of, as I mentioned before, the problem with misidentified cell lines, okay? So for this part of the applications, the applicants are required to provide a plan to tell us how are they planning to authenticate their cell lines, antibodies, even specialty chemicals, okay? And I just want to mention, this is really formalizing our expectations. Before, we expect that researchers were doing this kind of thing all along, Now this is formalizing our expectations and making sure that reviewers are incorporating these, are really thinking about these different areas as they score an application. Okay, and we're also looking at progress reports. So this policy rolled out in January of 2016. We also at the same time required that progress reports started to report on the rigor of the past year, the rigor of the experiments that were done in the past year, and the rigor of the planned experiments, okay? And the reason why we decided not to wait to roll out the progress reports, we wanted to make sure that those non-competing renewals for grants were awarded, that they were competitive for the next, that they were ready for the next competitive renewal. Because even though they came in and they were awarded before the policy went into effect, we want to make sure that as they're moving along in their progress, that they start to think about these problems of rigor. Okay. Now, as we know, training is going to be very important for rigor, and instruction in the design and conduct of rigorous experiments is a very important component of enhancing reproducibility. And the NIH published this guide notice down here to let the community know that this was going to be a coming expectation. So this was going to be required for institutional training grants, institutional career development grants, and individual fellowships. Now, originally we thought maybe we would go ahead and require this also in January 2016. But then we came to the realization that institutions really need more resources to develop these types of trainings, okay? So what we did is we funded the development of several training modules to enhance data reproducibility. And these are posted online. Anyone can use them. They're on the NAGMS clearinghouse. And it includes 4 NIH-produced training modules. And then right now there's about 6 training modules that were produced by the Society for Neuroscience. And as the other ones become available, they'll be posted on this website as well. Okay, so this is a quote from Richard Harris's book, Rigor Mortis, How Sloppy Science Creates Worthless Cures, Crushes Hope, and Wastes Billions. Now the quote says, "Graduate schools mostly teach facts the first year," said John Lorsch, director of the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences at the NIH. "They should teach methods." And then the book goes on to talk about how the NIH put out a call for they had put out a call to institutions asking for institutions to share their training that they have, or classes that they have in methods, in experimental design and methods. Unfortunately, I think they probably got just a few responses, but it was a bust, basically. So because of that, the NIGMS went ahead and they created these administrative supplements. So those institutions that have T32 training grants, they then applied for these administrative supplements to create those courses. Okay, so those courses hopefully will be coming around. Okay, so here are some of them that were funded. They include training in experimental rigor and reproducibility, open source training in computational competence and hands-on data analysis, experimental design, biostatistics, and quantitative analysis, and so on. Okay. All right, and then I want to mention, this is our website for rigor and reproducibility. This has been very useful for applicants and reviewers. Oops, there it is. So it includes FAQs, it has links to all the notices, articles, the blog posts, and reviewer guidance documents here. And this has been very popular. We've had about 200,000 hits in the first year. Okay. And then I want to mention that we are evaluating this policy. So this is an ongoing evaluation. So now we're in the step 2, the process evaluation. What we're doing is we're looking at how well applicants, paid attention to the instructions. Do they actually include information on scientific premise? Do they include more details on experimental design? Do they include an adequate authentication plan, et cetera? We're also doing an evaluation on the summary statements that reviewers provide. So we want to make sure that reviewers are paying attention and also scoring applications based on those 4 areas that I mentioned. Okay. Oh yeah, anecdotally, I want to say, one of the points, one of the reasons why the NIH, started this policy was to raise cultural awareness, and I think we are doing that. Many people have gone to visit the study section groups where they're reviewing applications, and these 4 areas are definitely being discussed more. There's, scientific societies have also released their own guidelines after we introduced this policy. And then we've heard that many institutions that they have created training for their own investigators around this policy. Okay. And then finally, I just want to mention instruction and responsible conduct of research. Okay, now this will be independent from the training that I was talking about previously in experimental design. But this instruction and responsible conduct of research has been a requirement for many years. And we hear positive feedback from it, not always, but and I think one of the requirements is that there be at least 8 contact hours. That means face-to-face hours of instruction, and I think that's very effective. It has to occur a minimum of once every 4 years, and the training needs to occur at each career stage. We also encourage the faculty to participate in this training, and I think that's also an important component as well. Okay, and I think each department at institutions, they come up with their own RCR based on what the needs of the researchers are. Some of the NIH suggested topics include data management and data sharing, of course, then handling allegations of research misconduct. And many institutions also include a course in experimental design in their RCR already. So I think, partially what's happening with RCR is hopefully there's a few things in there that may hopefully address the reproducibility issue. Okay, but again, there will be an upcoming requirement that really integrates this training in experimental design throughout the whole training process. Okay, all right, and that's all. Thank you very much. Questions?
Well, thank you very much for this clear explanation of what the NIH is doing. That's really great. Are there any questions or remarks people want to make? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. I have a question that might be a little off topic. It seemed, and I could have asked this at a previous session on, the funder's perspective, and it seems that most of the material has had to do with, compliance, oversight, how we can improve other people's research. But this is more about funding as a field of research, meta-research, and there seems to be, I don't know, it just seems to be a very scarce amount of it, and I don't know, NIH...
Wait, can you say that again? Funding?
Funding research about research.
Research on research.
So there was the Open Science Prize recently, but that was sort of, which was great. NIH was involved in that, that was sort of a one-off thing. There was one prize, one team got it, and all the other 90 entries are out of luck. Anyway, as you look through everything's sort of disease-specific, and not everything, but most things by institute. And anyways, for someone doing this kind of research, there seems to be very little at NIH, and I suspect most, from most funders. Okay. And so I'm sorry to pick on you. It could have been. Yeah, no.
So we work closely with ORI, for instance, and so ORI funds several, RCR type of studies. But so I want to say that, the funding priorities are set by each institute and Congress sometimes. So, I think it's an important topic, definitely, and I want to encourage people that have issues or ideas about particular fields that could use this type of research to contact a program officer in the field and talk to them about it, because I think if you start to plant the seed in their brains, they're the ones that write the FOAs, that you may have some effect in that case. So.
Of course, these are issues that span various...
Next question, please.
Okay.
Hi, Ray Spear from Journal Science and Engineering Ethics. I raised this question yesterday, but I'm going to ask you as well. In your grant applications, do you, by setting out certain categories, aim for reproducible results in the sense of replications of the data and different ways of coming at and challenging the data that you think you're doing, when that seems retrogressive from the point of view of progressing the research. My question is basically, are you encouraging people to do this by structuring your grant application forms so that there is money to do it?
Right, and so, so NIH has funded a few replication studies. And, my personal opinion is that replication is a part of doing science, and I think that is a component of when I don't think there's a problem with you saying in a grant application that you're going to reproduce something or replicate something.
Are you sure about that? Because
I'm positive.
I have a horrible feeling that doesn't work. That doesn't wash.
No, I'm positive. So if you go to the NIH grants,
do you actually have words in your grant application form saying that, how many replications of this thing are you going to do to prove things or whatever?
No, we don't have anything that says that you need to replicate a study. No.
Well, maybe you should.
No.
Brief question, please.
So I like the idea that you have RFIs for training, even in the absence of a lot of really good evidence that that's an effective intervention. I like that you're doing it. What I'm curious about is which program officers or what strategy would you recommend for getting funding to do direct replications, perhaps as a training exercise?
Right, so it's going to depend on what field. So if you have an idea of a particular field or that could really benefit from a replication of a particular study, then you would go and identify first the institute, then the program in that institute, and the program officer who oversees similar types of grants in the same field. So that's how you would find it. And you can look at that just look up the NIH reporter, you can search by key terms, and then you can find.
So just as a clarification, the training grants are also handled by the program officers in the discipline-specific fields?
The training grants those can be different. So the people that handle the R01 type grants, they may not necessarily handle the T32 grants. So that's a separate issue. But
thank you.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, if I understood you right, when you talked about scientific premises as one of the criteria, it was in one way, a more systematic way, looking at the background of the literature and the gaps. And we know that currently the best way to do a literature review is doing a systematic review. I'm just wondering why you don't say do a systematic review.
Do a systematic review?
Yeah.
I think, it's interesting the way these things go through committees and how the terminology comes to be. But that's the terminology that we landed on with scientific premise. And I think, a systematic review doesn't necessarily, we really wanted to focus on the rigor of those studies. So we really wanted people to talk about, whether the study was biased or unbiased, that type of thing. So we really wanted to focus the discussion on the rigor of those previous studies that they were using and supported their applications. So.
Thank you.
But it could include a systematic review as well. But I don't think there's room in an application to do a completely systematic review. But. Mm-hmm.
Last question, please.
Thanks, Patricia. Veronique Kiermer with PLOS. I think the NIH deserves a lot of credit for embracing this issue, and in particular the policy at the level of the grant applications and progress reports that you rolled out in 2016. You mentioned that the evaluation of that is ongoing. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you have any impressions or anecdotes to share with us in terms of early indicators with how the study sections and the panels reacted to these requests, and if you have anything in place to ensure that they actually do pay attention to that and don't revert back to the old ways.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we had a lot of training for the scientific review officers, who also then provided training for the reviewers, and then we tried to make sure that they kept everything on task, that people were talking about it. I think one of the things that came up was scientific premise. People thought that we meant, oh, you know, what are we asking? They thought we meant, like, this is the hypothesis of the study. So terminology, there was an issue there. The other issue that's coming up, I would say, is authentication. So, you know, it's not a scored component of the application at this point, and it's specifically not a scored component because we know that there are still resources that need to be developed around this. So I think there's a lot of questions about that. And then of course, like sex, that comes up all the time. And it depends on what type of study it is, but yeah, it's been going okay, I think.
Okay, thank you again very much.